It's my pleasure to welcome Norman Brosterman, the author of Inventing Kindergarten. Norman is an architect, a woodcarver, and a collector. To give you a little sense of his interests, Norman built a remarkable collection of art that depicts the future. This collection was bought and is part now of the permanent collection of a new science fiction museum in Seattle. I believe it's called the Science Fiction Experience, and part of the Experience Music Project, and part of what some people, including Bryn here, who is from Seattle, consider one of the least attractive buildings in the city.
It's Frank Gehry's worst building.
Frank Gehry's worst building. Combining Norman's interest in art and architecture and children, he also collected sets of building blocks and construction toys, which are now in the permanent collection of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. As to his educational background, all he'll admit to is that he went to kindergarten at PS 226 in Brooklyn. I met Norman when I was developing the idea of creating a museum of learning. I won't say much about that idea right now. I'm content to let the idea just play in your imagination for the moment. I will say, though, that I was discussing the Museum of Learning idea one day with a former dean of the Graduate School of Education, Ted Sizer. Now, many people who I described this idea for a Museum of Learning to were worried that I had in my mind some kind of dusty old museum. A colleague actually said, "You don't mean exhibits of Piaget's notebooks, do you?" So I was at that point foolishly and rather mindlessly anticipating this response from Ted Sizer and assured him that this wouldn't be a history museum, forgetting, of course, that Ted is, by training and deep down in his heart, a historian. So his response to my protest that it wouldn't be a history museum was, "Why not?" And he immediately started sketching out ideas for terrific historical displays that he thought that all of the data and materials would be available. But he did not talk about kindergarten. At about the same time, I got a call from Norman Brosterman, who had heard from Ken Robinson at the Getty in L.A. about this Museum of Learning idea. And Norman wanted to know if I had any interest in his collection of kindergarten artifacts. Well, the truth is that I really wasn't sure. At that point, I actually knew pretty little about the history of kindergarten, though I did know the name of Friedrich Froebel, because he was so often cited by educators in the extraordinary preschools in Reggio Emilia as a significant influence on them. So I started reading, and of course I started with Norman's book. And that was the beginning of a whole education for me, an education that has introduced me to one of the most fascinating and influential figures in the history of education, Friedrich Froebel, and to the history of kindergarten itself, which is a remarkable story. This history intersects and influences the history of the arts and education powerfully, but as Norman will argue, kindergarten as created by Froebel also intersects and powerfully influences the history of art in the 20th century. All of this is an exciting story. It's filled with beautiful objects, some of which you have seen on display, and if you're just coming in, I hope you'll take a few minutes at the end to look at them. And even if you've seen them before, I think at the end of the talk you may want to go back and look at them again. All of these objects and this story is really, I think, an inspiration in relation to the belief in the geometric and aesthetic capabilities of very young minds. So I'm pleased to have Norman here to share these extraordinary gifts and his extraordinary story with us. And then put this in your pocket.
Okay. I feel like I don't have to say anything after that. Just to be extremely brief, I was trained as an artist and an architect. And in the early 80s, just after I got out of architecture school, the economy collapsed, and a lot of architects lost their jobs. And I read years later there was a lost generation of architects, the people who never made it into the field. They became graphic designers, very common. They ended up working for theater design, a lot of related fields that were not architecture. And I started going to flea markets. And have made my living since 1982 selling old, cool stuff, if I can find it, you know. And I've had a lot of really unusual things, from Chinese antiquities to American spacesuit helmets. But when I started going to flea markets in the early 80s, there were all these building block toys, and they were everywhere, and they were really cheap, and I'd buy them just because they were fantastic abstractions of architecture. And I was always wondering if I'd find these Froebel blocks. When you study Frank Lloyd Wright in architecture school, they always talk about how he was trained with these special blocks, Froebel blocks. And it turned out that I had them long before I knew what they were, because if you saw them over there, the American ones say, occupation material for the kindergarten. What could be more boring? As it turned out, they didn't mean that they were designed to occupy children. They actually were an occupation. This was the work of children. And this is how I started on this. And you can, I can start the slides, can I? Let's see here. Friedrich Froebel. When he was born in 1782, died in 1852. So his life bracketed the Romantic era, at the end of the Enlightenment. And Goethe was alive when he was alive. They were both from around the same part of central southern Germany, near Weimar, in and around Weimar, near Switzerland. Well, that's terrific. That's a stained glass window from a school building in St. Louis. It looks very ecclesiastic, doesn't it? But that's a different emblem than you're used to seeing on stained glass windows, isn't it? When Froebel, his background was as a naturalist. He studied forestry. He worked on a farm briefly. He spent a lot of time alone in the woods as a child. And he became interested in education early on, and actually opened a school in Germany in around 1820 that lasted for about 20 years. And in Germany and in everywhere else in the world that had a contemporary education system or an advanced educational system at the time, children would start school at age 7. No one thought that young kids needed school or that they were capable of learning anything in school. But Froebel, after working with kids for so many years, recognized that you could really start teaching kids as soon as their eyes opened. So he had this idea, we need a kind of education for the very young, and he created a program. That is, he recognized the need, he studied what children needed when they were young, he figured out a way to teach them, and he decided what to teach them. This is quite extraordinary. I was just explaining this to someone. And he based the system of kindergarten on nature, of all things. It's a pedagogical system that has a foundation in reality. He would see as opposed to nothing. I don't know. I shouldn't say this kind of stuff to people in an education school because I don't really know much about it. Except I did go to school, and I have a 3-year-old who is in a little school now. But he based it on nature. He based it on the rhythms of the growth of plants and crystals. In a curious intersection around 1814, Froebel, who had studied natural sciences, at the time nature philosophy was about looking more than understanding because modern science hadn't been invented yet. Chemistry was really getting going. There were no X-rays until the early 20th century. He worked as the assistant to a man named Samuel Weiss in Berlin, who was one of the first of 2 or 3 people who invented and created the modern science of crystallography. And starting way back with Plato, people had this idea that there were things called atoms, perhaps before Plato, and that the forms of crystals, because they grow in these specific, very clear angles and shapes, were probably, and this is Samuel Weiss, probably based on the fact that when you're stacking these little tiny things, like apples, oranges, and grapefruits, depending on how you stack them, they will wind up with different shapes. And he turned out to be right. Now, Froebel was his assistant briefly. I think he was sort of like the lab technician who would take the rock crystals and put them away after the lectures, But he got 2 years to really look at this stuff. And he came to this remarkable realization that the plants that he'd always recognized as God's creations. His father was a Lutheran minister, incidentally. But early on in his life, nature became his God. And he writes about this a lot. Plants that he recognized for their rhythmic growth were exactly the same as crystals in the sense that they grew geometrically. And he had this idea that this God-given structure underlying all growth should therefore apply, these laws of growth should also apply to the growth of people and the growth of people in society and within themselves. And I won't do much reading. Unfortunately, this sounds like intelligent design. I was listening to this on NPR today. It's back in the state of Kansas. They keep trying to push it through. This anti-Darwin thing. Of course, this is way before Darwin, and after thousands of years of God being responsible for the creation of all things on earth. As the shapes of crystals are the outcome of the same natural laws that result in the growth of children, people, and entire societies, handling and manipulating models of these forms correctly would reveal and illuminate the logic of creation. This was kindergarten. Another thing that became important in kindergarten was the grid. This is Pestalozzi. Is this in focus? I can never tell when I'm this close. Yeah, is it good? Okay. Behind Pestalozzi and this room full of barefoot orphans are these very strange charts. Pestalozzi was Froebel's teacher. He's considered you would know this, he's considered the first modern educator. That is, don't beat them, treat them nicely, and they will learn. And this is the way he approached kids in Switzerland in the late 18th century. So Froebel worked for him for a couple of years as a teacher. And Pestalozzi early on, this is 1803, had this idea that children could be taught to draw with a system, and the system is behind him, where he could announce to a class something like A3, and the children would all know, oh, that's a short diagonal line, or B14, oh, that's a long horizontal line. And by reading out this long list of numbers and letters, which sounds very Cartesian, which it was, kids would make drawings. Now, this didn't really work, as you might imagine, and it was abandoned pretty quickly. It actually, though, led to, there were several people who worked for Pestalozzi who later on in the 19th century invented pedagogical drawing systems for the very young. But the thing that Froebel took from this most especially was the grid. And on the other slide you can see that's a page from a catalog of kindergarten material. I have a lot of these catalogs. They're very useful because you can tell how the system was sold and how it changed. That's an extremely modern piece of furniture she's sitting at. It's a table with 1-inch squares incised into the surface. So the children, all those activities that you see over there on the table that are portable, like the blocks and the sticks and the rings, were used on these gridded tables. It became the universe, the small universe, the pictorial space of the kindergarten. A couple of Los Angeles kindergartens. These photos are over there. Every kindergarten had a garden. And I'll say it once again. Kindergartners were gardeners of children. They are not the kids. They were the teachers. If you speak German, you would know that. I don't. But most people don't realize that. That's the way they approached education. It was about a seed that had within it extraordinary potential that could be guided toward education and learning simple and complex lessons. What Froebel wanted to do, here's a couple more kindergartens. By the way, I also wanted to mention that the photos look like the kids are really not happy. These photos were taken before flash photography. So there's somebody back there going, hold still. And that's what you look like when you're a 4-year-old and you're holding still. This is the first public kindergarten in America. It was in St. Louis, 1873. And that on the left is an African-American kindergarten in the South. And that picture is not Jesus. That's Friedrich Froebel, a German crystallographer, of all things. I was also saying recently, just to give you an idea what happened later, if you search the word kindergarten on Google now, you get approximately 11 million results. And if you search the word Christianity, you get 13 million. Now, you would expect a huge number for Christianity, but kindergarten has been around, which has been around 150 years, is probably the largest international institution of all time. Because, I didn't ask this, did anyone here not go to kindergarten? Really? It served you well. Where did you grow up? Here?
Staten Island.
Staten Island. Why? Was it a timing thing? Do you know why?
No, I don't know why.
I wonder. And you? Do you know why you didn't go to kindergarten?
They didn't have it in school.
Where was this?
In Philadelphia.
Oh, really? Really? But almost everybody goes to kindergarten in every country in the world. They have different names for it. Most of them are either kindergarten or the garden of children or the garden or the children's garden in the local language. And it's been like that since probably around the 1870s. So what did Froebel want to teach kids? His idea was that you could teach little children how to learn, how to observe, reason, express, and create. This is not about skills. It's not about reading and writing. It led to reading and writing, of course. It led to arithmetic. And how did he intend to do this? He recognized that children played. That's what they really do. So he decided you could have kids play in a way that would teach them what you wanted them to learn. And that's what kindergarten was based on. It had a lot of music. If you went to kindergarten for 3 hours, only about 15 minutes to a half an hour a day would be in using those beautiful objects and those kinds of crafts. The gifts and occupations. The rest of the day was gymnastics, singing, dancing, movement, and gardening. Then there was always, the nap thing, which I think started really early. These are really little children. Kindergarten teachers are almost always women. Froebel had no real mother. I think that was a big part of it. But of course, at that time, women were the child rearers anyway. His philosophical ideas. This is the first gift you're looking at, by the way. And I'll just get right back to this. The gifts are called gifts because they were supposed to be gifts from the teacher, who was the mother's stand-in a sense. It was all supposed to be fun. We've got a great new gift for you today, and this is what we're going to do. So some of Froebel's philosophy, unity and interconnectedness, this is from that romantic notion. The unity between all things, between a person and nature, between people in society, and especially within oneself. He wanted to create balanced people, starting from the very young. And this idea of connecting opposites, where nothing is ever hanging alone, became extremely important for him. If you showed something, you typically showed its antithesis. As a matter of fact, I will just get to that. The first gift was designed for the very young, literally infants. And you could play, these are little song games. His most popular book was called Mother Play Songs. And we should have projected one of those turn your cell phone things off, like they have in the theater. But that was a big book, and it lasted a long time. It influenced a tremendous number of books, and it was a book of music and little games that you would play with your little child, like leading to, of course, I'm a Little Teapot, the Itsy Bitsy Spider. All this stuff starts with Froebel. My daughter had these balls when she was very little. They make this stuff now. You can get all this stuff, and she loved these. One day, she'd walk by and pick them up, start swinging them around, doing just this kind of thing. The second, this shows you, these are pictures of the first gift shown with some of the other gifts in some of these workbooks that you see over there. To give you an idea, this is the kind of thing Froebel relished, where nothing was independent, that you could portray one with the other and move back and forth. Once the gifts were introduced, they were never used necessarily in the same order. They could mix it up. Another note, most of the books of patterns on that table were made by the teachers. That's why they look so elegant. But they did this in normal schools, where they were learning to teach kindergarten, so that they could then do the work with the children. But what happened? The teachers, some of them were geniuses, and they made these brilliant design albums. And they were all unsung young women, generally speaking. So, unity, the second gift, the ball, all round, all movement, the cube, all flat, all static, and the cylinder, the combination of the two. This is Hegel. It's the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And he really had that in mind, just to show children that nothing remains, nothing is alone. And if you take, what they would do with the second gift, if you take the cube, and they have these little pins, these little sort of grommets and holes, you could spin them. If you take the cube and you spin it from one of its flat planes, it looks like there's a cylinder in it. It's very obvious. And if you take the cylinder and you spin it from one of its curved sides, you can see there's a sphere in it. So the kids would do this, and they would know he was right. You know, all in everything. Nature study, self-education, very important. The teachers really were guides. It wasn't about lecturing, which is the way every other child got taught for most of the 19th century, I guess into the 20th, at all ages. Froebel is buried under that picture under the left, but that's actually a trade card from Milton Bradley. So there's the guy, local guy who's going to sell kindergarten material in America, and that's his card. It's Froebel's tomb. It became a gigantic business, and it started in Springfield, Massachusetts, in America, when women from Boston convinced Milton Bradley, Milton himself, to start making kindergarten material in 1869. And he made a tremendous amount, and it lasted into the 1930s probably, and it was sold in huge quantities. While I think about it, at the beginning, and I have a tremendous archive, I've been looking for this stuff for years. The very first year that they sold kindergarten material, there was one page. That was the catalog. There was one page. About 20 years later, it was an 80-page book. So people started to affect the system by making more stuff that was kindergarten. So Froebel's kindergarten became another thing, because all this other stuff was manufactured for sale. See, so it became, it's a very gigantic, complicated story. And this is the cover of a Dutch book from 1903 with an extremely modern cover. I'll speed it up. That's St. Louis again. These are the blocks, and I'll just explain what they did with this stuff. Symbolic education. They used these materials to do a lot of different things, but they made pictures, and they made designs, and they did it to lead to words. He had this idea about, this is how it worked with the gifts in any case. There were what he called forms of nature or life. Now these were things you could see. Flowers, chairs, people. This is a bath, supposedly, up on the upper right. Bathtub. That's in one of the books. There are a lot of textbooks that show you design examples. That also became a problem because after Froebel died, people started to get the feeling, oh, we're not allowed to make that. That's not in the book. You see, it became kind of stiffened up. The idea was that it would be universal and infinite. Forms of nature. Forms of knowledge or mathematics, and that's the Pythagorean theorem on the left. I know you all recognize that. They would use the blocks and the gifts and the materials to start on counting, subtracting, geometry. If you could explain cubes, what they were. You could explain how two cubes were a rectangle. You could explain how the faces of cubes were squares, and they used them that way. And then there were what he called forms of beauty, or art, or symmetry. And these are just patterns. And because he thought that children recognize beauty in symmetry, there are a lot of symmetrical patterns, and they appear in these books. And the swastika, by the way, appears very commonly because the patterns were often rotational designs where you would change the pieces and slowly the whole image would change as you changed one part on each leg. So what happens? He is telling children that this is some of the exercises with the gifts, with the block gifts. But get this. This is a lesson that is not. Well, this is a lesson that comes through for these kids and it was intentional and not, that since you're using the same materials to make the forms of nature and life, and to make the forms of knowledge, to make the forms of beauty, all of these things are interchangeable. This is Froebel. They are all the same thing, and it's life, and it's the universe, and its growth. And he intended that to happen. Now, of course, they never explain this to 3 to 7-year-olds. Some of the patterns for the block gifts, you can see the swastika here. They would use the blocks flat to make these patterns, obviously. They would also build things with these blocks. And that led to the 7th gift, which were parquetry tiles, which is an old art form, marquetry, parquetry, mosaic. And they were sold as wood pieces like that. They were sold as paper that were gummed, that you could make permanent pictures. And on the left are... I was very interested in this fragmentation that happens in the system because of my interest in modern art and architecture. So I would seek out, and I have a very large number of these mosaic toys. Now, those are not kindergarten gifts, but they're the same, essentially. So the kids would do this geometric, abstract stuff in school. Then they'd go home, maybe, and they do this geometric, abstract stuff at home for fun. They would introduce these by taking the square pieces and putting them up to the faces of the cube and peeling them away to show the children that the cube was made out of planes. So the system starts with 3 dimensions, and it goes to 2, and then it goes to 1. This is where it's headed. Some of the, this is the 7th gift, some of the patterns. There are a great number of these old textbooks. You probably have some in your library here, undoubtedly. Harvard's got some of these books. They appear in a lot of old libraries. Here's some work with the tiles. This is the glued on. Now, each gift was better and not so good for certain of the forms. So the tiles were pretty good for making the nature forms because you could really make pictures out of them. But what they would do is they wouldn't just make a picture. They would say, well, what have you made? Or the teacher would say, let's make a chair. And they would make chairs. And they'd go, what do you do with chairs? Well, we sit in chairs, and we can play a chair game, and we eat dinner in chairs, and we have chairs at home. You see what this is? It's using pictures to lead to everything else. This was a language of form for kids who didn't know how to read, write, and didn't necessarily have very advanced verbal skills. It was deliberately designed that way. Then it went to linear gifts. These are some of them. Sticks, rings. They would draw with sticks. It was a very good way to draw, because then you could sweep it away and draw something else. These jointed slats are very nice to explain angles. And they're always in transformation. It's very Froebelian. You could weave with sticks and then pick up the weaving and put it on a string and spin it. Or you could take a piece of paper and glue it to the sticks and make something that you could hold up to the sun. That's one of the things he wrote about. Here's some of the exercises with the sticks. This is in one of my teacher's books. I love this. Bird, Here's the bird. Extremely abstract. Metal rings for curves. Drawing was the middle gift. And this drawing book is actually on the table. It's really exactly like Sol LeWitt, if you know his work, where they explain, take 3 colors, draw them in the horizontal directions. The instructions for making the drawings are on the page, on each of the pages. Some more drawing stuff. I don't know if you can make it out. They would draw on gridded slates with slate pencils. They would also draw in books or on graph paper with pencil or ink. Here's some drawing. This is the kindergarten at the Centennial. I just got this photo on eBay. I've been looking for it for 15 years. This one is actually from the Library of Congress, but it's identical. But look what's behind these kids on the blackboard. It's a gridded blackboard. And then on the left, and this is an interesting thing for Massachusetts. In Massachusetts in the 1870s, they had state-mandated drawing for children starting at a certain age. And there's a book by a woman who used to teach here in Boston, Diana Korzenik, about drawing education, and especially drawing education in Massachusetts. Now here's a Winslow Homer painting, an extraordinary watercolor of a young woman teaching drawing in Boston, most likely. If you know Homer at all, I consider the greatest American painter. I don't know if I'm alone in that. I doubt it. He had some kind of failed romance when he was living in Boston, and he fled and he moved to Prouts Neck, Maine. He never came back. He traveled the world, but he lived up there alone most of his life. And there was, when this painting was at the Metropolitan Museum a few years ago, they first of all got the caption wrong. They were describing it as Homer's comment on art education. Actually, it's an actual view of a Boston or Massachusetts drawing class for little children from the 1870s or 80s. So there's speculation that this was the woman that he was in love with and who spurned him. They don't really know. But if you can find out, now knowing that if this woman was an actual drawing teacher, it might be easier to find out. And if you can find out, you'll get a PhD. Because Homer is so important. And that's the kind of thing that there's like nothing left to write about Winslow Homer. You know, when I was researching this book, someone did a dissertation on Kandinsky's grandparents. Because there was just nothing left to write. You know. And they really wanted to write about Kandinsky. So the next gift really goes from solid to plain to line to point. And they do this pinpricking. They would punch through paper on these felt pads. And this is so Froebelian, to make something out of atoms. It's back to his crystal days. But look at this book. It's just rhythmic designs, extremely abstract. Then if you're going to make holes, you may as well connect the two ends with thread. So he goes back, it starts to sweep back into lines. Sewing. And I remember sewing in kindergarten in 1957. We were given this kind of open work material and blunt needles and wool, and we could sew. And I remember doing this. Some of these sewing books you feel like you found a guide to something that you can't understand, like a language you don't know except it's beautiful. Like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something, like a book from another planet. You know, the books on that table, some of them are 75 feet long. I have 10,000 pages of work made by teachers and another several hundred made by kids. So sewing. These are very early St. Louis sewing books. 1874. Looks like modern art. Paper cutting, which is the old snowflake thing, fold a piece of paper. Just to give you an idea how kindergartens changed, though, at the beginning they were cutting crystals, and then people were cutting snowflakes, and then they were cutting winter, and later they were cutting Christmas. This is what happens. It becomes less about nature and more about the products of the human race, the man-made. A real Froebelian would always use all the pieces. When you were using those block gifts, they're cubes. They would take them out of the boxes by lifting the box. There's the cube, the single object. They take them apart. They would never change them. They were only transformed. And then they put them back. Then they put the box back. And then they'd slip the top under. So you were just transforming a perfect form. And they would do the same with the cutting. If you cut it, you would use all the pieces. Now this changes too, because I have so much of this stuff. People would abandon them. At some point it became a design exercise, pure and simple. Now the French early on abandoned the German philosophy. They couldn't deal with it. So they made the system more abstract, because it really truly was design exercises for the very young. You know, with paper cutting you can really make some perfect nature forms. They would trace them and cut them out. Silhouette work, of course, is an old art form, especially in Central Europe. Those, by the way, let's see if this works. That's child's work on the left. It's really great. I went through Providence today. I have an incredible album of work that a mother put together of 4 of her children's work from Providence. It's fantastic. And at the end of it, one of the kids has beautiful watercolors. This is when the child is maybe 10, and it's a fantastic thing to see. Here's some cutting. Pretty modern. And weaving paper. And here I was talking to someone about this. The weaving is easier than it looked, although they used half-inch, quarter-inch, eighth-inch paper, so the older you got, the thinner the paper would be. But they use these needles. They're flat pieces of steel with a little clip on the end. And I've got these. I've got everything. I don't know where I got them, and they'd make the pieces pre-slit, and then they'd come in the same package with these, what they called the fringes. So you'd attach the fringe to the needle, and the needle really went through the whole thing. So this weaving was as much about counting and rhythm as it was about the kind of the hand skills of actual weaving. But you can see on the left, the weavings get a little choppy when you start making pictures out of them. That's children's work on the left. This is a teacher's album. And weaving with sticks. I don't think this is that easy, because I've tried it. It's not clear. I would imagine every particular teacher had their favorites, and it would not necessarily be necessary to use them all. And kindergarten played out over many years as well. You didn't go to kindergarten for 1 year. Kindergarten was preschool and kindergarten. It was everything before first grade, depending on where you were. And as I was saying before, Froebel invents kindergarten in 1839, comes up with this great name, the Garden of Children, or the Children's Garden. And it's at a time when the agrarian societies were becoming more industrialized, so parents needed a place to put their kids more. So it's one of these fortuitous intersections where schools for the very young became more important as he was inventing kindergarten.
Were they held in the same buildings as schools for older children?
Well, some of them certainly were, because I have photos where they show the different classrooms. They wound up everywhere. They wound up, in Meiji, Japan. They wound up all over the United States. By 1900, there were 400 kindergarten associations in America. They were in religious schools. In Germany, curiously, they were banned when Froebel was alive in 1849. There was a failed revolution that brought a lot of Germans to the United States. liberals, anarchists, the kind of people that were looking for something modern in education. And Froebel's nephew wrote something called Democracy in Kindergarten, something like that, and it got tainted. Kindergarten got tainted in Japan, in Germany, and it was banned, even as it had been taking off, and it was getting going in a lot of the parts of Germany. So the rest of Europe actually got a jump on kindergarten. Well, the Germans were... The church, which ran most of the schools in Germany, weren't that enthusiastic about it either, because they couldn't really control it, since it wasn't based on church doctrine. And these jointed slats, and this is very difficult. They would twist paper into patterns. I don't think a lot of that got done. Origami. I have some incredible work like this, and this is now heading back to 3 dimensions. Peas work. You take peas and soak them in water, and they turn to like Play-Doh, and then you use sticks and make structures, or you use pins and corks. He has Buckminster Fuller, bless him, who talked about learning in a Newton, Massachusetts kindergarten. He had very bad eyesight, so they would give him these peas and sticks, and he couldn't really see what he was doing, but he could tell that if you made triangles, it was much stiffer structure than it was if you made squares. So here the thing he became most famous for, he learned in kindergarten, making these geodesic structures, right here in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is really ground zero for American kindergarten. Elizabeth Peabody and her sisters, Mary Mann, who married Horace Mann, and her other sister married Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Elizabeth Peabody's friends, Thoreau, Branson Alcott, the Transcendental Movement. She was the first big American proponent of kindergarten in Salem and in Boston. And the end of the system is modeling clay, which you could do anything, make anything with modeling clay. So, I'm really behind. So what happens if you take you take millions of the young children in Europe, especially in Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, England, and in Japan, and later in China, and especially in the United States. You take all these little kids and you teach them a language of abstract form. And the younger the child, the more abstract. It was always like that. Well, you might expect something to happen. And I suspect a lot of stuff happened, but the easiest thing for me to understand that probably happened is, on the left there's a page from Alfred Barr's book Cubism and Abstract Art from 1936. He was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art. And the book is very interesting. It has a genealogical chart in it, literally, where it shows Seurat leading to Brock, and then Mondrian coming out of this, and Kandinsky leading to this, and in the text that goes with this page, where he's showing a painting by Theo van Doesburg and a house plan by Mies van der Rohe, and then a house by Walter Gropius, he's going something like, isn't it interesting? Like, wow, look at this, how they all stem from one another. Well, it's not in the book. This is a page from that same Dutch book from 1903. This never gets mentioned in books on modern art. Yet, and this is interesting, the parents of the children who were taught in kindergarten did not go to kindergarten. This is a real break, a real leap. The kids did, the parents didn't. By the time modern art was invented, there were probably 2 generations, at least, if not 3, of people who had been exposed to the original Froebelian kindergarten. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright spoke about this and wrote about this often, and he's the reason I got into this, because I was wondering where these Frank Lloyd Wright blocks were, and everything he ever did, literally everything he ever did, you can find in this simple system. Now, it doesn't mean that he went back to look at his kindergarten books, but he learned a system, and he stuck with it. Every building is designed on a grid. He got into hexagonal grids, triangular grids, even circular grids later on. The Guggenheim is two circles that meet at the centers. This is the famous Coonley Kindergarten in Oak Forest. And when I lectured at Unity Temple here, where they gave me a laser pointer. It was fantastic. I was standing in this masterpiece with a laser pointer. Has anyone been in this building? Yeah, this is it's Oak Park, Illinois. This is where his first great work was built. He's from Oak Park. It's the Unitarian Church. It still looks out of place there. That's how modern it is. And you walk into a cube, and the lights are balls and cubes hanging from strings. You know, it's like 1905, maybe 1903. Here is the Larkin building in Buffalo and some kindergarten. Here's that bath again. I couldn't resist. The Larkin building was demolished in the 50s. It's still an empty lot. This is one of the great disasters of modern architecture. It was the headquarters of the Larkin. I think they made soap. I can't remember. All is unity. All springs from unity, strives for and leads to unity, and returns to unity at last. That's Friedrich Froebel, 1827. Unity was their watchword, the sign and symbol that thrilled them, the unity of all things. That's Frank Lloyd Wright, 1932. The stones in my hand and under my eyes turn to living, speaking forms. That's Froebel. The smooth, shapely maple blocks with which to build, the sense of which never afterward leaves the fingers, so form became feeling. That's Wright, 1932. And if you want another one, there's a million of them. I can still see my hazel buds like angels opening for me the great God's temple of nature. I now had what I needed. To the church life was added the nature temple. To the religious life, the life of nature. This is what happened to Froebel. Encouraged by my early training at the kindergarten table and subsequent work on the farm in the valley, I came to feel that in the nature of nature, I would come upon nothing not sacred. Nature had become my Bible. This is Frank Lloyd Wright. It's all interchangeable for him. This is the plan of a synagogue near Philadelphia on the left, and this is a little kindergarten. You know, I tried to stay within what seemed to me to be facts. It wasn't just, oh, that really looks like that must have a relationship, you know? There's so many connections between the kindergarten and modernism. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright again, the Price Tower in Oklahoma, one of his only, or maybe his only skyscraper. It's not very big. It's now a hotel. There's some origami. Wright was constantly pinwheeling. Kenneth Frampton, the great architectural historian of the modern era, described Dutch modern architecture as centrifugal. Frank Lloyd Wright had a big part in creating Dutch modern architecture. It's very interesting. His work was published in Holland and Germany before it got going in Europe. Le Corbusier, the other of the two guys who are considered the great architects of the 20th century. Le Corbusier, born in La Chaux-de-Fonds, very close to Neuchâtel in Switzerland, just as Froebel, the Froebel system becomes absolutely total in that area. That like 10 years earlier, he spends 7 years in a Froebel school as a child. So the two great geniuses of 20th century architecture both started at the same place with their Froebel education. I should back up and say nobody else became Frank Lloyd Wright, and nobody else became Le Corbusier. But one other thing did happen. People accepted their work, right? The audience was also trained with this stuff, you know? This is the Villa Stein. I've just made it from the photo to the finished drawing, showing his Corbu liked to put lines to generate rhythm. You see those diagonal lines? They're regulating lines. And here's kind of the rough drawing, and then that's by an American woman named Mildred something, who's a kindergartner. But if you stay on, you can see that's completely done on a grid. If you stay on the grid, you'll wind up with that. Here's Corbusier designing a city on the right, which he did a lot of, to the unfortunate detriment of a lot of American cities when they got bastardized into gigantic housing projects. Joseph Albers, on the right, was a teacher of little children for 15 years before he went to the Bauhaus. So did he go to kindergarten? Probably. Did he know what it was? No question. Did he look at the stuff? He had to. Kindergarten at this point was not the zeitgeist. It was daily life. Everybody did this stuff. Every kid did this stuff. This looks like Albers, of course. This is kind of minimal for a kindergarten book, actually. This is pretty bold on the right. Johannes Itten, who did this print, it's a famous book on color theory. I think it's much later, from the 50s maybe, 60s. He was invited by Walter Gropius to become the first master at the Bauhaus, 1919, in Weimar. Before he comes there and starts the preliminary course, the Vor course, which is really 2D design. Everyone goes through this when they're in art school. This has come straight from Bauhaus and Itten. He was a kindergarten teacher in Vienna, a trained Froebelian kindergarten teacher. Paul Klee, Swiss, musician, artist, mathematician. That's Klee on the right. That's kindergarten on the left. Klee's teaching at the Bauhaus and has regular meetings with Froebel teacher. He also taught weaving. Very interesting that Klee would teach weaving at the Bauhaus. Here's one of his paintings. He called them magic squares. He did one of these every year until the end of his life, from the beginning during the Bauhaus years, or maybe just earlier. That's a little kindergarten on the left. Oops, excuse me. Klee did these beautiful calligraphic drawings where he used something like carbon paper. It gives it this very funky edge, beautiful. And he was a musician, and these are often explained or described as like musical notation. They also have a lot to do, at least visually, with stuff like that on the left. Now, Kandinsky went to kindergarten in Florence, where his parents, well-to-do Russians and German speakers, spent a year in Italy, or 2 years, around 1869. And I tried to find this kindergarten. I found an Italian woman who tried to find this kind of stuff, but it's like, this is a project. Here's another dissertation. When the Uffizi was bombed years ago, you remember that? One of the things that was destroyed, incredibly, was 400 or 500 years of agricultural records of crops in Italy, because it was an office building originally, and some of this stuff is still there. So God knows, it may be possible to find Kandinsky's kindergarten. This is the great painting from the Bauhaus years, after he's with Klee and Itten and Breuer and all these guys who are kindergarten kids. You can see how it relates to all this material. I actually made this out of kindergarten material for a magazine called Cabinet, which is a beautiful quarterly that comes out of Brooklyn. It's a very beautiful art magazine that is a non-profit and very, very interesting. They really begged me to make this, and I did, and it took days, and then they printed it upside down. Now that could have happened. You'd think they'd know better. But after he started doing these paintings, he never went back to the Expressionist paintings that he became famous for at the beginning. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which I like better. But this one's fantastic. Mondrian, raised in Holland in a building that is owned by his father, that is a school. His father is a drawing teacher. Mondrian wants to become a painter. His father says, before you become a painter, maybe you should do what I do. He's a licensed drawing teacher in the state of Holland to teach the young how to draw. This goes all the way back to Pestalozzi. These are drawing teachers' workbooks. I've got a stack of these from Holland from 1890. That's how you did it on the left. They actually start with a dot, and then they go to a line, and then they go to squares, and then they go to bigger squares, etc., etc. So Mondrian is living in a house with a gridded blackboard, and then takes 6 years to become a drawing teacher in Holland. And in all the bios of Mondrian, I mean, when I started on this, I thought, well, Mondrian, So I started reading. In the first page of the bios of Mondrian, they say he was a trained drawing teacher in Holland. But they never say, in any of the books I found anyway, well, how interesting, how they teach drawing in Holland, in 1890? They just never did that. But this is how they taught drawing in Holland. And as usual, the youngest kids got the most abstract stuff. At the age where if you told them this is the way you made pictures, they would think this is the way you made pictures. If you told them this was the world, they would think this is the world. They're only 4. I have a 3-year-old. I could tell her anything. Actually, she already doesn't believe me. She knows everything already, So that's Mondrian on the right, one of the famous pier and ocean drawings. That's 1874 in Connecticut on the left. There are a million theories about Mondrian. Theosophy was certainly a big part of it. He was trying to make something, like back to Kandinsky, the spiritual in art. This was in the air at the time. They wanted to go beyond reality and find this perfection that they thought existed. But there are a lot of other theories about Mondrian, and none of them mention kindergarten. Here's Mondrian on the right. That painting on the left was just sold for a lot of money. It's actually tape. I think it's now in California. Van Doesburg, Mondrian's compatriot in De Style. And then finally, this is a flower on the right. It took me a long time to figure that out when I was looking at it closely. That's a man made out of origami. This comes from a pattern-making toy from France from the 1840s. And that's Juan Gris over on the left. I had to wonder about Cubism. Now, Picasso didn't go to kindergarten. In Spain, he didn't. But Braque, almost, and here's another one. I couldn't find it, but I had someone in France trying to get into this library in Argenteuil, where Braque grew up. And it was like, she couldn't even get in there. Apparently there is information on his early life. The interesting thing would be to find out, did he go to a Catholic school or a state-run school? Because if it was a state-run school, then he did kindergarten, Braque. And he made pictures out of little brown prisms, little brown triangles. Cubism is always described as the disintegration of something. But it can easily be explained exactly the reverse way, the synthesis of parts to make a picture. And if you read any kind of recent stuff about the invention of Cubism, Picasso led Braque to abstraction, but Braque is credited with the first cubistic paintings. His father was a house painter. Finally, after my book came out, there was a show on Paul Strand at the Metropolitan Museum, the so-called first photographer who made intentionally abstract photos. At least he got the credit. He grew up on the Upper West Side of New York, went to the Ethical Culture School, had one of the first kindergartens in New York. But in his house, his aunt, who raised him, was a kindergarten teacher. Exactly. In his house. And Maria Homburg, the curator of photography at the Met, after reading my book, wrote that in her catalog. Actually, she didn't write that. This is sour grapes. She wrote, for more information on kindergarten, see Brosterman. She didn't write, I got this idea by reading Brosterman. But she did because I knew her, But since I'm not an academic, it doesn't matter to me. Just personally. Some more Paul Strand photos, and that's that. That's that. Okay? Thank you. So, questions, yes? Questions? Any questions? Yes.
Any connection between Steiner and the kindergarten movement?
Well, all educational movements after, I mean, this got going really early. So Steiner starts around 1903, 1908, something like that, you know. I think their philosophies are basically identical, that you will find perfection in nature. There's a lot of movement in the Steiner schools, isn't there? I don't know much about it. But like I was explaining to someone before, what's brilliant about Froebel is he comes up with a really simple way of making objects. It's much easier to make triangles than it is to carve wood. And the Steiner kids, they actually wind up carving wood. I carve wood. I can tell you it's easier. You know, this stuff that he made was supposed to be made locally. It's easy to make little blocks. It's easy to make little triangles. You can make them out of paper. But the philosophy, I think, is very similar. Yes?
In America, when you're saying Elizabeth Peabody and Brosterman, were they kind of starting the kindergarten?
Elizabeth Peabody opened a kindergarten in Boston in 1860 and then realized that she didn't know enough about kindergarten and actually went to Germany and studied with Froebel's widow and came back, and in 1863 with her sister Mary Mann published the first American book. It's not the first publication, but it's the first American book on kindergarten. And it is not a guide. It does not have patterns or pictures, but it's really about Froebel's philosophy. It's called, I don't have the 1863 edition. It's something that's eluded me. But I have a later edition. I can't remember. Is it The Republic of Childhood? This comes from Froebel, The Free Republic of Childhood, something like that. But Peabody stayed with it for a while. But actually after that, German women took over her school and really started the first training school for kindergartners was in Boston. And then Frank Lloyd Wright's mother went to one of these schools. When they moved to Weymouth, is that how it's pronounced? Which is near here someplace. And he grew up there, even though he was born in Wisconsin, about 20 miles from the first American kindergarten. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but that was 1855 in Watertown, Wisconsin, which was started by the first kindergarten in London and the first kindergarten in America, both started by Jewish sisters who had left Germany in 1848. Yes. One of them, by the way, the American married Carl Schurz. Do you know that name? There's a Carl Schurz Park in New York. He was I think he was in the House of Representatives. I'm not sure exactly. Was he? Okay. She was married to him.
Was kindergarten curriculum standardized in all of these? Was there like, I know you have these gifts in order, but when you say went to kindergarten, does that mean you did a program with all the gifts?
Yeah, this was kindergarten. But there was also the music, and there was also the dancing and the gardening, and a good kindergartner would use this stuff in an infinite, fluid, beautiful, rhythmic way. But what happened, like I said, as it got farther away from Froebel, these textbooks became a little standardized. And a funny thing, and I was very interested in this, they reprinted each other's pictures. So the pictures that started in a Dutch book in 1859 wound up in a French book in 1860, and then in an American book in 1869, and in a German book the same year. You see, this is almost the same pictures. So there was a tendency to say, well, those are the pictures, those are the patterns, But then to contradict that, when you go through these teachers' albums, and I have I have 10,000 pages of work made by women. Well, it's about 200 books. Some of the books have, 200 pages, which is incredible. There's a tremendous amount of diversity. And I would keep, my wife would say, why do you need another one of those books? I said, well, there's stuff in here I've never seen before. That's why. And I'm very curious, because that's what interested me, that the system could go places I hadn't seen it go. Yes? Can you stand up? I can't hear you.
In sort of pure Freudian philosophy, to what extent, if at all, was there a push toward realism in pictures? That is, was there a push toward getting things to look like flowers, like houses, like...
Only within the nature forms. That is, that's the thing. He did everything. Think about it. Pictures of things, that's everything. Then mathematics, that's sort of the intellectual. And then patterns. So he didn't know. Within the nature forms, within each one, you can't make a flower that well with cubes, but they could make a bed, No, I don't think so. But by making an equivalency though, between the three and all the materials, this lesson that nothing was really standalone, I think, was supposed to come through. Wait a minute, didn't we just count with those blocks? Yeah, we did, but now we're making a bed, that kind of thing. No, I don't think so. You see some of those beautiful cutouts because it's easy to do that if you're an adult with a scissor. So, thank you for coming.